In this lesson, we're going to begin a journey into our own origins. We'll call it Becoming Human. And first, we'll take a look at the context of our own species' origin. This evolutionary tree shows that our closest living relatives are chimpanzees. So here we are, humans up here, and here are the chimps, and notice we have a recent common ancestor with the chimps. But we also see we have a more distant ancestor with gorillas and orangutans and gibbons and old world monkeys, new world monkeys, lemurs, etc. So notice the common ancestors go progressively farther back in time. This is our section of the primate branch on the tree of life. We share a common ancestor with chimps that lived roughly 7 million years ago. And that common ancestor species was an ape living in a forest habitat. But we do have much closer relatives called hominins who are no longer living. So while chimps are our closest relatives that are existing today, we do have closer relatives, but they died. So they were extinct ancestors. The word hominin refers to all the species since the split from the common ancestor with chimps. Now, at some point in that evolutionary path, we're going to start to call those ancestors Homo. So they would be human ancestors. And the examples of this group would be Homo habilis and Homo erectus. And then we ourselves are called Homo sapiens. And there are some characteristics that all of the groups share. And they include a relatively large brain size, indicating a high degree of intelligence, a smaller and flatter face compared to, say, apes, smaller jaws and teeth, again compared to apes, an increased reliance on culture, particularly the use of stone tools to exploit a greater diversity of environments. Now, along the way also, of course, we're going to be inventing mental tools like words and language, but we'll address that later. Now, how do we know about these extinct relatives? Well, through fossils. So these fossils are transitional species, capturing an evolutionary change from ape to human. Although these ancient hominins are now extinct, they remain our closest relatives on the family tree. So notice the tree is rather bushy here, and here are some of the ancestors. And now we go a little bit further along in time. And now here are some more recent ancestors. And now over here we have some very recent ancestors. But notice there were multiple human species living at the same time in the past. So if we just go back 2 million years, there are a bunch of branches here. These would be separate human species. So there were multiple human species living together at the same time. But only one human species survived into the present, and that's us. We can use this tree to put all of our sort of close relatives on the same tree, and here we are up at the top here. And you'll notice we have very close relatives, and then on other branches farther away, we have more distant relatives. But there is some direct line of ancestry back through time to that common ancestor with the chimps. These other species would be species that went extinct and did not leave descendants into the present. So only the species at the top line here, only us humans exist as one human species. Our human relatives went extinct. Well, here's a closer look at our closest relatives. We have the bonobos, and we have the common chimp. And here is the human neighborhood on the tree of life. We have the bonobo and chimp over here. Notice they have a very recent common ancestor. And then we have humans here. Notice chimps and bonobos are thought to share more traits with the common ancestor than humans do. After all, the chimps and bonobos still live in the forests like we think the common ancestor did. So when that split happened, when one species branched into two species, there was thought to be more evolutionary change in our lineage. And if we just think about some of the differences between our two species, we can get a sense of the magnitude of that change. Let's take chimps first. They have minimal culture. There is some, but it's minimal. There is some social learning. They can watch each other and learn to do things that others are doing. They can imitate each other and emulate. But there's poor collaboration. They don't work well together, and they have small collective brains. In other words, they don't link their brains together to solve problems anywhere near the magnitude that we do. For us, advanced culture, high social learning, high collaboration, and large collective brains. We are especially equipped to put our brains together to solve the challenges of life. So in our lineage, there was a lot more evolutionary change, leading to the modern human species. So how did this branching happen? Well, before we address that, it's instructive to learn a little bit about how chimps live in their own habitat, which is equivalent to the ancestral environment. Well, here we've got a picture of a chimp, mother chimp and her baby, and here's another one over here. The most important thing animals do is produce offspring that survive to reproduce. In most mammals, females raise the young. In apes, the only strong connection is between mother and infant. The hormone oxytocin bonds mother to infant and infant to mother. In one patch of forest, chimps can eat approximately 235 different things. Most food comes in small morsels, so much time spent foraging. Apes can eat leaves, which are digested by microbes in their large guts. And mothers can forage while carrying her infant. But ape mothers struggle to produce enough milk for their infants. Ape milk is watery and low in nutrition compared to other mammals, for example, a cat or a human. Slow growth allows infants to survive on low-quality milk. At birth, the chimp brain is roughly 1/2 the size of the adult. By 18 months, chimp brain is full size. Now here we have some chimps spreading out as they go about foraging for food. In the forest, a mother can forage to find small clumps of food and water while carrying her infant. She doesn't depend on others to get most of her calories. And as we'll see, that's going to be a big difference between the chimps today and our species and our ancestors as well. So the way this species gets its calories, it's pretty much solitary foraging. And they have to spend a lot of time because the food is dispersed. It's nearby, but it's dispersed. And they have to forage around the forest to get their calories. And if you're a mother with an infant, you've got to carry your infant on your back. Now, young chimps must learn food foraging and processing, nest building and protection, etc. in their first 3 to 7 years. But what the chimps learn about their environment and how to be a chimp is mostly coming from their mother. So while the mother and father contribute DNA, genes, to the offspring, it's mostly the mother that transmits cultural knowledge to the offspring. In chimps, cultural learning has not taken off. It is limited by the way chimps raise their young and the nature of the problems they must solve to survive in their forest environment. Chimps live amongst each other, but they don't link their minds to solve problems. They don't have to. If mom discovers something new and useful, her offspring can learn it. If dad discovers something new and useful, it likely dies with him. And this feature of chimp life helps explain why they have smaller collective brains. They don't pass on their newfound discoveries as efficiently as humans do. So why did the common ancestor species produce 2 evolutionary lines of descent? We've just taken a look at how chimps live in the forest, and bonobos have some similarities. And the way they live in the forest today is thought to be similar to how the ape species, the common ancestor species, might have lived some 6-7 million years ago. But what caused the branching here, the split from one species into 2? Well, we've learned in earlier evolution units that the branching on the tree of life is often associated with members of one species getting separated into different environments with different selection pressures. The separated populations evolve different adaptations and over time become separate species. And this is what scientists think happened. that roughly 6-7 million years ago, climate change caused a reduction in forests and the expansion of woodlands and grasslands. Some individuals of the common ancestor species were forced to adapt to a new habitat, and they were our ancestors. So here is the original forest with the ancestral common ancestor ape species living in the forest. But as the forests began to recede and we have more and more woodlands and grasslands opening up, some of that common ancestor species, some of those individuals had to make a living in this new environment, and they would be our ancestors. On the other hand, the apes, the individuals of that common ancestor species that stayed in the forest, they were the ancestors of today's modern chimps and bonobos. So the ancestors of today's chimps stayed in the forests. And since forest conditions did not change much, there was less evolutionary change. So this would be an explanation for why we think that the common ancestor species resembles more the chimps than it did the modern humans. Because the ancestors were living in the forest, and the forest conditions haven't changed much, and so you wouldn't expect as much natural selection altering the species over time. On the other hand, the ancestors of humans had to live in a new environment. And this new environment then set up new selection pressures. So there was a big change in the environment, and that's going to trigger more evolutionary change in our lineage. That population of apes had to expand their range to meet their needs. There were new opportunities. Look at all the protein available, if you could just somehow get that protein. But there were also new threats: hyenas and lions and leopards. The basic idea is the new environment forced a new dietary, social, and then cultural way of life for our ancestors. Our ancestors evolved new physical adaptations to survive in the new environment, including the environment created by our own cultural innovations. In the next lesson, we'll meet some of the key figures along the path towards the evolution of the human species.